Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Meriwether Tharp. We just had a really fun first and 15 there, DawgNation.com. On a day like we've had a couple times this week, finding a way to have a little bit of fun, probably a pretty good thing. Our audience was certainly doing a good job with that a moment ago. And we'll take more of your comments when we're done today. As a part of our R.S. Andrews cool down, we'll also deal with the serious stuff that's going on. Continued, aftermath of the news that we learned yesterday on Jalen Carter. On today's show, I'm going to read you Carter's statement. He deserves to have his words out there in the public record. Many of you have already read it, but just for the purpose of this show, we'll do that. I've got just a little bit to say on this topic. I'm going to save it for the end of the show just because I don't want to be too heavy-handed with it, but I do have a couple things I want to get off my chest about this. So we will do that then. But off the top, I hope you're okay with this. I believe you will be. Off the top, kind of getting away from some of that news, I don't think you should miss some of the stuff that Nolan Smith had to say yesterday at the NFL Scouting Combine. Some of this I'm going to say for you to watch on video. You can see this in the Dog Nation video channel. Some of this I think is worth playing for you here right now. Just really strong words from a guy that I think when it's all said and done is going to probably end up being one of my favorite players from this era of Georgia football. Just really, really good stuff from Nolan Smith, and it works from a couple of different vantage points. So we'll do that with you. We'll welcome Terrence Edwards into the program today. We'll get ready to watch a lot of these guys perform, former Dogs, at the NFL Scouting Combine as the workouts get going today. So all of that is on the way as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Meriwether Tharp, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Meriwether Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
All right, if you're with us yesterday, you kind of know the drill here. We have some business later on we have to take care of as it relates to what we learned yesterday about Jalen Carter and kind of what's next and all of that. We'll do what needs to be done, throughout the show just because we sort of have to. But prior to that, let's do some of the stuff that we want to do. Let's do some of the stuff that we enjoy doing. Let's try to have a little bit of fun here. And I think that it's one of those things that because the Carter thing sort of ended up being a very big deal yesterday, it can almost take a lot of the attention away from things that ought to be getting some attention. And I want to make sure off the top of our show that we don't do that because in Indianapolis, the NFL Scouting Combine has started. Workouts, today. We had some really cool stuff with some press conference things yesterday. Well, there's also some Georgia guys who will speak to the media, I think, today. Christopher Smith maybe and some of that kind of stuff. So we're going to keep our eye on a lot of that. But, y'all, I thought yesterday, Nolan Smith, former Georgia outside linebacker, I thought he just gave a wonderful press conference. And Nolan's just one of those guys that I think when it's all said and done, I was saying this to our video audience before our show began today. When it's all said and done, I think that Nolan Smith's going to kind of end up being one of my favorite players from this era of Georgia football. And the idea of sort of a favorite player is kind of a child's thing, I guess. But I think if you're an adult, it's okay to have some favorite players. The guys I sort of gravitate to as my favorite players associated with Georgia football are the ones that I think sort of stand for something meaningful. And I think that Nolan Smith has kind of always had a little bit of insight into what is meaningful. Nolan comes across to me as a pretty wise guy. I don't mean like wise guy. I mean like he's a wise person. He kind of comes across as a guy that has a little bit of wisdom. I thought that prior to the 2021 national championship, I thought that Nolan probably articulated at that time what it would mean for Georgia to win a national championship. And I think there's a certain aspect of doing something really big, I think does require an understanding of how big that achievement would be and sort of being okay with the size of that achievement. And Nolan, I thought, framed it really well of, hey, I'm a Georgian. I'm playing for my state university. We're trying to win our first national championship in a long time prior to what went down in 2021. And Nolan, I think, really articulated all of that pretty well. And, there was the moment after the Florida game in 2021 when, there was some criticism for Stetson Bennett, and Nolan stepped up and put himself between Bennett and that criticism. Another example of Nolan at times being wise and sort of understanding what needed to be said in a particular moment. There were lots of examples of that over the course of Nolan Smith's career at Georgia, and I think he ought to be remembered for that. And some of the stuff that he said this week at the NFL Scouting Combine should not be overlooked or forgotten or just, I guess it shouldn't be unnoticed on the basis of some of the other stuff that we've kind of been talking about here. So I want to make sure that we kind of bring some of this to you here right now. Now, first of all, there is a very emotional moment from this press conference with Nolan Smith that I think sort of works better as a video. So if you go to the DawgNation YouTube page, or the DawgNation, I think it was originally on Facebook, DawgNation Facebook, but if you go to the DawgNation video channels, YouTube's probably the easiest way to watch this. DawgNation YouTube page, watch for the part where Nolan, for the first time, I believe, I think he says this is the first time, talks about what Devin Willock meant to him and how the tragic accident that we're obviously all still talking about, the tragic accident involving Devin Willock impacted him personally. It's really touching, and I think it's worth kind of seeing in sort of the original format. So if you go to the DawgNation YouTube page, you can see that for yourself. Instead here, I want to talk about a different subject for a moment. Once again, the notion that Nolan, as kind of a great leader, I think has some wisdom here that extends beyond just what is good for Georgia football. In this conversation, at the NFL Scouting Combine in Indianapolis on Wednesday, the subject comes up of, hey, being in a place like Georgia that's very rich in talent, and you don't just sort of step on the field and kind of dominate right away. You have to kind of work your way into a position where you're playing and contributing and doing things like that. You have to be a little bit patient. You were the number one recruit coming out of high school, but at Georgia, every player on the team was some version of a lauded recruit, and so therefore you have to fight for your spot on a roster like this. And Nolan, it seems, is very proud of himself for coming to a place like Georgia where you are asked to do some things that are just a little bit harder. And Nolan, it seems, rightly so, I would say, very proud of himself for enduring that. And this is the kind of message that I don't think Georgia fans should miss. Good stuff from Nolan Smith talking about what it was like challenging himself every day while competing alongside his teammates there at the University of Georgia. Very, very good stuff from Nolan Smith. Take a listen to this.
Man, working hard and loving the program, and Coach Smart, I just know, man, he believed in me, because a lot of people think I was undersized, and I'm not like other guys. Some guys, I wouldn't say take the easy way out, but when things don't go their way, especially like in life now, guys transfer, guys leave. That's just not how you do it. You stick in your program, you work hard, and you prove to your coach that I should be on that field. And I had to sit back. It wasn't the guys in front of me were better, man. Aziz Ojolari, man, I would just watch guys work, and a lot of people don't say that, but I was a young kid. I had a lot of learning to do. I didn't know the system. I didn't know the plays, and that's when, if you don't know your plays and stuff, your coach can't put you out there. And that's where a lot of people fall off at. But, I just worked hard and never doubted. And my mom always told me, man, you never had it easy in life, so just keep working.
So there's an aspect of what Nolan Smith says there that kind of reminds me of something that Isaiah Wilson once told me, and I realized that Isaiah Wilson's NFL career kind of turned out to be something a little bit different, but clearly Isaiah was a terrific player as a part of the Georgia offensive line years ago, and he kind of talked about some of the same stuff, that he came into the program at the same time as Andrew Thomas. Thomas was ready to play right away as a true freshman in 2017. Isaiah Wilson wasn't. But Wilson said, I was content to sit there and watch Andrew do what he did. I was content to learn from that. And by 2018, now Isaiah Wilson sort of had his moment. He became a big part of the Georgia offensive line after that. In other words, Nolan Smith is not the only former Georgia player, maybe even current Georgia player, who would tell a similar story of, hey, I was humble enough to understand that even though I've got great talent, even though I've been recognized as a recruit for having kind of this outsized athletic ability, I've still got plenty to learn. And the other guys that I'm competing with, maybe they're also just as good an athlete as I am, but they have the extra dose of experience added to that athleticism that I don't currently have. And Nolan Smith said, hey, I'm willing to do what needs to be done to get the seasoning I need to get so that I can be the kind of player I want to be. And y'all, this. Not every player is that way. And, I still believe that if you talk about the recipe, the formula for how you build a great football team, whether it be at Georgia or a place like that, trying your best, and this is one of those things that just seems like it's more art than science, but trying your best to identify the players who are willing to do this is just not easy, but it is imperative. It is an absolute need to be able to recognize the players kind of coming out of high school who are willing to put in the work and willing to be patient while that work pays the dividends to eventually be a really good football player. And so the fact that Georgia has had guys like Nolan Smith, I think it's really good for Georgia. But beyond that, the fact that current players, or at least in Nolan's case, at the end of having been a current player, getting ready to start his NFL future, the fact that contemporary players are saying this about hard work, I also think is really good too, because I know it comes across as sort of old man on the porch, kind of, back in my day type stuff, to have any kind of complaint at all about transfer portal or some of the new stuff that exists in college football. But I do think that all of that makes the job of coaching more difficult. And that doesn't just impact coaches who in some cases go on to the NFL, but it also removes, at least in some cases, the coach's opportunity to be a positive influence in the life of the player. If the player can turn tail and run at the first sign of adversity, if the player can reject the message from a coach because it's just not what he wants to hear in that particular moment, then something is lost by the player if he doesn't get access to that coaching, because it really is the coaching in many cases that turns you into the player you get a chance to be. And in this particular case, it's not just good for Georgia that Nolan Smith craved that coaching. I think it speaks well of the future of college football that there are still players that understand, hey, even this day and age in which it's sort of set up for me to get whatever it is that I want in the moment, there is still a lot of value in looking at what I want most later as opposed to what I kind of want right now. And I think that Nolan Smith kind of represents that pretty well. Then beyond that, Nolan, it's kind of an interesting moment. Sometimes in these long press conferences, 10, 15-minute type thing, maybe some media members kind of show up late or whatever else, and this just sort of happens. And occasionally the same question will be asked again. And in this respect, I guess Nolan, it's hard to hear the questions, but I guess Nolan was asked a very similar question than he was asked before, but kind of cool and very certainly gentlemanly of Nolan from the standpoint that he didn't mind being asked the same question again, because he kind of got back in the pulpit one more time to talk about just how important this idea is for him. If you're a Georgia fan, I don't think you should miss it. Once again, very strong stuff from Nolan, kind of speaking out against what I guess I'll call transfer culture. Really good from Nolan yesterday. Take a listen to this.
Yeah, I just answered that question, man. No, you're okay. I say it again. Kids need to hear this. Stick it out. Just because things get tough, don't run away from things. In life, when things get tough, you're going to quit on your wife, you're going to quit on your kids, you're going to transfer on your wife and kids when things get tough. What if you married your wife for 10 years and she get cancer, you just going to get up and leave? That's how I think about it, man. You be a man of character no matter what you do, and that's how my mom raised me.
Don't you love that? He says, hey, listen, you got to be a man of character. That's just good stuff. And obviously in a show like this, we talk about Georgia football, and listen, I enjoy being a Georgia football fan. I like it when Georgia wins games. You do as well. Most of you do, and that's kind of the commonality we share together. But beyond that, sometimes I do think about this, not to be overly philosophical, but I do sort of think about this sometimes is it good to like football this much? Is football a good thing? Is football a net positive on life, or is this kind of a distraction that's taking us away from something that's more important? And when you hear Nolan Smith say things like that, I think you're left to conclude that football isn't just fun. It actually might be good. I think it actually probably is good. It's a force for good because it does remind us of how you become, as Nolan Smith says, a man of character. If we didn't have something like football, explaining that would take a long time. Explaining that would be complicated. Explaining that might even be impossible. But with the presence of football, we're able to say, hey, don't just quit because it gets hard. Don't just transfer because it gets hard. Endure this, and then, as Nolan says, you will be able to endure whatever you might have in life after that. That's a very young man speaking very wise words. It's the kind of thing, even in the midst of what's turned out to be a pretty busy week for Georgia, I don't think you should miss. So go to the DawgNation YouTube page, watch the full thing. There's some good stuff from Robert Beal we'll probably get to tomorrow. There's some stuff happening in the Combine today that we're going to have fun unpacking there too. But a lot of Georgia players who've had fantastic careers, including back-to-back national championships, now getting ready to start their NFL futures, and we are rooting for them as they do that. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Meriwether Tharp, and we are happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app, 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, on the radio at noon, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Just really happy to have you with us here today, and really, really thankful for our friends at Meriwether Tharp who make all of this possible. You know Meriwether Tharp by now because you've heard me talk about them so much. They are your source for Georgia divorce, and I understand this. Divorce is one of those things, when you hear me bring this up, it stops you in your tracks in some respects, either because you've got bad memories of your own situation, you've got anxiety about your future situation, you've got kind of this looming, I guess, dread about what might be your current situation for an audience the size of ours, just law of big numbers tells you hard for me to say, but certainly true nonetheless, statistically significant portion of our audience is just going to be facing this situation at some point in time. And if I could wave that magic wand and sort of make this disappear for you and make it go away, obviously I would. If you could work to prevent this from happening, obviously I think that's something you should do. But at a certain point in time, you sort of realize, hey, the work has been done, yet the outcome is not going to be what I want it to be. Well, if that's your reality, then at that point in time, it's time to reach out to my friends at Meriwether Tharp, because you want a strong advocate by your side to help make sense of a confusing situation and help set you up for a happier, more enjoyable success, more enjoyable season of life coming up when all this is done. That's what Meriwether Tharp is all about. They understand the kind of, I guess, sort of offshoot conversations that come with divorce, your financial situation, your relationships, all that kind of stuff, including with your children. That's all just really, really serious aspects of this discussion. Meriwether Tharp understands that, and they want to help you understand it. They want to help you understand how the law can be leveraged for your benefit here. So let's have that conversation. It's a free initial discussion with one of those Meriwether Tharp attorneys. You can find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That is theatlantadivorceteam.com. Meriwether Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. So reach out and make sure you find them today. All right, we're going to reach out to Terrence Edwards here coming up in just a couple of moments. We'll talk to Terrence. NFL scouting combine stuff. Terrence's thoughts on the Jalen Carter situation. We'll do all of that. Also, before the show is done today, I'm going to have a couple of thoughts on kind of all that we've learned here as of late, too. I'm going to try to keep this short, try to keep it brief, try to keep from being too much of a blowhard on this, but I do want to give a couple of opinions on that, so I'll do that right at the very end of the show. For now, though, let's go around the DawgHouse. And, yesterday we learned of Jalen Carter's presence at the accident scene that resulted in the death of Devin Willock and Chandler LaCroix. The Athens Clarke County Police Department released a statement literally right as we were taking the air yesterday that revealed they were charging Carter with 2 misdemeanors related to all of this. Kirby Smart released a statement. All that kind of took place while we were on the air yesterday. Well, after we were off the air, Jalen Carter released his own statement, and just because we want to kind of be fair here and get everything on the record, let's give you what Jalen Carter had to say on his own behalf yesterday. He put this out on Twitter, a statement that says, "This morning," meaning yesterday, "I received a telephone call from Athens, Georgia Police Department informing me that 2 misdemeanor warrants have been issued against me for reckless driving and racing a charge. Numerous media reports have also circulated this morning containing inaccurate information," he says, "concerning the tragic events of January 15th, 2023. It is my intention to return to Athens to answer these misdemeanor charges against me and to make certain that the complete and accurate truth is presented," Carter says. He goes on to say, "There is no question in my mind that when all of the facts are known, that I will be fully exonerated of any criminal wrongdoing." Once again, that is a statement yesterday from Jalen Carter. Last night, I guess it was around 11:30 at night, I believe, Carter did return to Athens, turned himself in basically to the Athens Clarke County Police Department and was booked, posted bond, and now he is out on that. So we will see what happens with this next. As I told you yesterday, the one thing that really no one should dispute is that Jalen Carter, like anybody else, famous or not, has every right to a legal defense here. And so in this particular case, Carter is going to mount that legal defense. Now, what complicates this is it's also kind of that sort of PR battle he has to fight ahead of the NFL draft, and we'll kind of leave that for him to kind of deal with on his own. But when it comes to like the actual legal part of all of this, Carter's got every right to a legal defense, which means remaining silent when he wants to remain silent or speaking out when he wants to speak out. He says he's going to bring in some facts that exonerate him. We will see if that is what happens here, but we'll be more than happy to when he speaks on the record about this particular situation, or when anybody at Georgia speaks on the record about this particular situation. We'll make sure that we bring that to you so that you kind of know what's out there. But that was the statement from Jalen Carter yesterday, and then the action later on that night, facing those charges, showing back up in Athens after having been, we believe, in Indianapolis. He posts bond on those misdemeanor charges. So that is the story on that. And then we will see where all of this goes from here. So as we said off the top of the program, as we get ready to welcome in Terrence Edwards to the program, there's some stuff we have to do. That kind of feels like one of those things you just sort of have to do because you can, you just want to make sure you fully on the record about all of this and everybody get everybody's statements out there. There is also stuff that we enjoy doing, and some of that's all, what we're going to do here in a minute, kind of looking at some of the Georgia guys on their way to the NFL draft. We got some interesting stories out in the SEC, some coaching type stuff to kind of give to you there. So we got a lot of ground to cover away from the Carter news here today too. So we'll do what we have to do. We'll do what we want to do, and we'll try to mix it all together and see how it works out. And you can judge us when it's all said and done. For now, you've heard enough of my voice. How about a voice you love on Thursdays? It's the great former Dawg, Terrence Edwards. He joins us here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Always love having Terrence Edwards on this program. Happy to have him here. DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp. And Terrence, let me get the unpleasant stuff out of the way first. Yesterday, we learned about something that up until yesterday had not been publicly available news. It had been kind of certainly kicked around the rumor mill, but not publicly available news of Jalen Carter's presence and I guess, potential involvement in some form or fashion in the traffic accident that killed Devin Willick and Chandler LaCroix. Misdemeanor charges. Carter speaks out. He comes back to Athens to face those charges. What is your opinion about what's playing out here right now?
Well, first and foremost, we still, say condolences to the families that the two that lost their life. That's first and foremost is, that I'm thinking about in this situation, no matter what news come out. Two people, tragically lost their life, and I'm always thinking about them. I saw what Nolan Smith had to say about Dale yesterday, and that's how his teammates feel about him. And with the Carter incident coming out, I was just thinking about when I was in school and all just the childish things that we did as young adults, and I personally just think this is one of those childish things that we thought that never could happen to us. As my old teammate George Foster tweeted yesterday, and Damian Garrett tweeted as well, then I retweeted, like, we know not to go 100 miles an hour inside the city limits, but we all getting on Loop 10 or 316 went excess speeds. So I just think this is a childish act that led to the death of two wonderful people that needed not to be in the situations that they're in right now. But my focus is with those families grieving in their loss.
Yeah, Terrence, I think we can maybe all look back on our life and think about, listen, I got one speeding ticket for sure when I was going very, very fast when I was about 18. I got another one that was really pretty fast for the road that I was driving on. So, certainly, and I didn't drive anywhere near as nice a car as a lot of these, football players, are now. But I certainly understand the idea of when you were young, you just sort of feel invincible, don't you? And this is one of those things that now, you're a coach, you work with young players. I'm a dad. I coach my son's team, so I guess in some respects, kind of involved in some of that kind of stuff too. Like, to me, the hardest thing to explain as an adult working with, whether it be high school students, college students, even children, is the idea that the fundamental unfairness of life is that you can do something over a matter of just a couple of seconds that can define your life forever. And it doesn't feel like it should be that way, but we got countless examples that proves that it is. And that's one of those things of, I don't know how you communicate that message necessarily, because we've been trying to do this now for centuries, and it just doesn't feel like we're ever going to get any better at it. But that's just kind of what life is. When you are young, you sort of feel like you can kind of do anything. You can kind of, in some respects, even feel like you can get away with anything. But we got countless examples that kind of prove that's not true. And as a coach, as a parent, as a a teacher, as a mentor, as a whatever, it just never gets any easier to communicate that, does it?
Oh, most definitely. I think the cycle continues from generation to generation, because I could definitely remember some of the things, the do's and the don'ts that my parents told me not to do, and I did opposite. Now that I have my own children, I tell them the same do's and don'ts, and I'm pretty sure they're going to do the opposite as well once they get to driving age. I just think, man, just in this situation, I just think once the kids leave your house, you just pray to God to cover your kids once they leave your sight, and pray that they come home to you, because you never think that this will happen to you. I think that is the mindset that we have as kids, that we hear about it, but it won't happen to me. And once it does happen close to home, it's a different perspective. But just growing up without the advent of social media, I really didn't know anyone that died in a car accident when doing, some childish behavior. I didn't know anyone. So it didn't hit home. But now with the advent of social media, and now that you can see it happen over and over and how much it happens, but kids still won't listen. As a coach, I tell kids all the time, and they're still going to do what they want to do until something happens to them. They won't understand. I think all of us have been to that point where we don't understand what the adults are trying to tell us until it happens to us, and none of us think it will.
So you said it so perfectly earlier. There's an aspect of this story that's far more important than football, and yet we're also still kind of a football show. So I'll ask you, from a football standpoint, what do you think this means for Jalen Carter? How would you assume the NFL teams are going to view the information as we understand it right now?
I think they're going to ask, and I think what Jalen needs to do for someone who's been in this situation but not getting in trouble, but been in these type of interviews, having an older brother that was a first-round pick, he just needs to be straight out, truthful, and honest. Because the NFL spends a lot of money investigating these situations, especially with a guy that's projected to be a number one pick. They're going to do their due diligence, and they're going to have the information. And I think most teams just want Jalen to be honest and open. And I personally don't think this is going to drop him down the draft board tremendously. There may be some teams like we just don't want to take him. We just don't. Okay. But I think he's still going to be a top player, a top number one pick. Jalen just has to go in there and with these owners and personnel, GMs, coaches, and just be straight up honest and tell them exactly what happened, because 9 times out of 10, they already know.
So moving on, I guess a little bit happier subject, the other Georgia players in Indianapolis competing for their chance to earn the respect of NFL personnel men. We played some audio of Nolan Smith a little earlier. How much do you love Nolan, Terrence, sort of speaking out about, his decision to sort of stick it out at Georgia, or the value of sticking it out at a place like Georgia and competing and maybe not having the whole world handed to you right when you first get here, having to sort of fight to earn that. That's a former number one recruit nationally, embracing the notion of hard work and really challenging other players at Georgia and across college football to embrace that hard work too. I think that speaks well to the future of football if a guy like Nolan understands just how valuable the hard part of football still is.
Right. I got to know Nolan a little bit just because we share a common coach. My high school coach, Rick Tomlin, who coached me at Washington County High School, actually coached Nolan at Calvary Day for a few years before he transferred to IMG. And I listened to this morning what Nolan had to say, and that's the old school approach that, times is going to get hard, and you have to stick it out sometimes. If there's no wrongdoing for any bodily harm or anything to that matter, you heard me say this over and over. 6 months is not determined an appropriate time for someone to transfer. And there's times that I believe there's appropriate times to transfer.
Yeah.
There's 3. Joe Burrow, I give an example for him. I think that was an appropriate time for him to transfer. I think if I'm not mistaken, I think he had graduated in 3 years. He's fulfilled all his obligations. He didn't see a pathway to playing at Ohio State, and he used the transfer portal in the right way, in my opinion, to transfer and gain eligibility immediately at LSU. But just kids transferring out within 1 year, 6 months, like you don't know what's going to happen with your career. And I stand with Nolan on that and that part of the transfer portal. And he didn't come in and automatically, as being the top player in his class, and earn playing time. He had to wait his turn. And I say this all the time, and everybody can go look. The first national championship team, the 21-22 team, all those immediate players waited their turn. None of them came in and started immediately, besides Keelan Ringo, if I'm not mistaken. Jordan Davis of the world, the Nakobe Deans of the world. They all waited their turn. And when their turn came, it was time for them to be the leaders of the team. So you can stick it out if you have that attitude to stay, those are the guys that I want on my team.
No, I think that's exactly right. When you look at some of these Georgia guys who are, trying to make their move here, both at Combine, Pro Day, the next few weeks leading into the draft, which story or maybe a couple of stories sort of stand out as most interesting to you?
I think Chris Smith has got an interesting story.
Yeah.
For someone who's known Chris since he was in high school, and Chris came, as a low 4-star, maybe a 3-star cornerback. I don't think a lot of people knew Chris Smith as a football player. I think they saw what people had to say about his game. He's another kid that waited his turn. He transitioned into playing safety when he was originally slated to play cornerback. A guy that could have transferred when other guys was playing ahead of him. And I say this all the time. Richard LeCount is one of my favorite players of all time. Just his personality, his playing ability. But Chris Smith had a better career at the University of Georgia than one of the higher-ranked players that Georgia has ever received. Him and Chris Smith played the same position, and Chris had a better career at Georgia than Richard did. So I just think Chris is one of those guys that you just continue to fight, and that's the family that he comes from, that a family of fighters. He has a brother that just transferred from Kansas State to Georgia Southern, who's a heck of a football player as well, T.J. Smith. And I've known that family for a long time. But Chris' story and him getting an opportunity to play. Everybody go and look up Hapeville Charter.
Yeah.
And see what type of facilities
For
they have, where they come from. Don't have a practice field, but produce some of the better football players in the state of Georgia. So Chris Smith, I'm happy for. I'm glad he got the opportunity to show everyone the talent that he's possessing. So
what do you think, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but with the case of Smith, you're talking about a guy as a safety that's sub 200 pounds, and he may even be sub 190. How do you think NFL teams are going to view that? Is that the kind of thing that they shouldn't care that much about because the tape speaks for itself? Does the size matter when you're trying to make that transition to the NFL? Chris is obviously not the biggest guy in the world, but very few players played bigger than he did for Georgia. How much should what the scales say matter when it comes to Chris?
I think GMs and pro personnel people still have a model of what they think players should look at. So I think Chris is going to get dinged a little bit because of his natural size. But I'm gonna go and have people to go look at another Georgia kid that plays for the Cincinnati Bengals named Mike Helton. I think he came from Sandy Creek.
Okay.
It's probably one of the better nickel corners in the NFL. And I think Chris can ultimately play in the nickel. He's tough enough to play in the box and have cover skills because he was a corner, be able to cover some of the guys that plays in the slot. So he's going to get dinged. I think if Chris was 6 feet, 200 pounds, I think he's a first rounder, but because he's probably going to be measured at 5'10", I think he was at Senior Bowl, 188 pounds, that's going to be a little red flag for him. But once you turn on that tape, his football skills and his football smarts will take over, but the NFL is all about the look of a player more than, in my opinion.
Do we lose Terrence? We lost Terrence. See if we can get him back on for 1 second. I want to ask him one more question if we can. So what Terrence is saying there about Christopher Smith, I think, is all really well said. And it kind of goes back to, I was joking with our video audience. I think I did this yesterday, and I did it a little bit this morning too. I was an NFL GM. Like, the only thing I really care about is, were you good in college? Like, I don't get that into the combine, and I realize that life is more complicated than what I'm making it out to be right here. I do understand that life is more complicated. But for me, if you played well in college, I'm going to assume that you have a chance of being good in the NFL. And some of these guys that maybe didn't quite show it in college, but they're lighting the world on fire in some of the drill times and things like that when it comes to the NFL scouting combine, I would always just be kind of suspicious of that. I realized that, as I said before, the actual sport of football is slightly more complicated than that. But for me, it's the tape for Smith that ought to speak the most there, and it sounds like certainly Terrence Edwards kind of agrees with that too. Interesting comparison there. Terrence, let me give you one more thing, and thanks for being back with us here. Let me give you one more question before we let you go here today. So if we look at Jalen Carter, certain first-round pick, even with the stuff that's going on, that's not, I don't believe, in dispute. I would say that Broderick Jones is a likely first-round pick, more likely than not, certainly. So let me give you that kind of next group of Georgia guys. Between Keely Ringo, Darnell Washington, Nolan Smith, from that trio right there, which of those guys would you most emphatically make the case for being deserving of being taken in the first round?
I think Keely. I think Keely is. Everyone knows how I feel about him. I think he's a world of a talent. Have all the skills that he needs to possess to be a great corner. But like I said, the NFL is about how to look, and he's going to bring the look. He's going to wow people at his pro day. He's going to wow people at the combine. It's probably going to be almost 6'2", 205-pound corner that's probably going to run sub 4.3. So he's going to wow people. And a lot of times GMs and people start looking at players in shorts and T-shirts instead of helmets and shoulder pads, and they get bumped up the draft board. So I think Keely is going to just amaze people. And the NFL people, they have big egos. They're going to see Keely as this big specimen, which he is, and they're like, I could fix him. He could work with me. And they're going to draft him, and he is a first-round talent. So I think he's probably going to shoot up the draft board in shirts and T-shirts, because he's going to just wow everyone with his athletic ability.
That's good stuff, Terrence. I appreciate your time. And remind folks as well, if you don't mind, speaking of wowing folks, you're wowing folks every day, and the guys that are working with you are also drawing plenty of praise themselves this time of year with that Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy, getting better at catching the football, getting better at all the things that wide receivers and tight ends, things like that, they're supposed to be able to do. You're helping them do it. So if people want to get more of that personal instruction, how can they reach out and get in touch with you?
Yes, you can find me on all social media platforms at Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy.
Hey, great stuff, Terrence. Thanks for being here. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Love Terrence on the show. I really do. One of my favorite times of the week is when I get a chance to talk to Terrence Edwards. He just brings a lot of football knowledge, and it kind of comes from a place of, hey, I've been there, done that. I just like what he brings to the table, and I'm always happy to have him as a part of our show. I'm also happy to go cruise around the SEC with you, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Of course, talking about cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, makes me wish I was on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation right now. A lot of you know we just got back from one ourselves. We were on Wonder of the Seas, largest cruise ship in the world. And I got to tell you, it was an unbelievable time. You know, going to all the various locations, and some of the locations we were actually at are going to be destinations we're also visiting as part of our Dog Nation cruise too. We went to Nassau in the Bahamas. We went to Perfect Day Coco Cay. And, you know, I love Perfect Day Coco Cay because I am fully convinced it's just sort of a sure thing that, you know, I had a chance to be there back in December. Everybody who was there loved it. I had a chance to be there with our Dog Nation cruise back last April. Everybody who was there loved it. My wife and I were lucky enough to be there last February there as well. Once again, just the hit of the whole trip. My kids on this trip we were on this past week, they'll tell you that was probably their favorite part of the entire deal. It is a private island oasis right there in the Bahamas. And for me right now, even though we talk about all the big ships and the way in which the kind of new categories of Royal Caribbean cruise ships continue to kind of push the envelope, what it means to take a cruise vacation, for me, the thing that sets out Royal Caribbean from anybody else, land-based vacations or anything else, is that private island in the Bahamas that you can only get to on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, and you could only enjoy as a part of a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. You've heard me talk about Perfect Day Coco Cay. You ought to investigate this yourself. You ought to search it online. You ought to talk to our friend Jessica Slater. Let her tell you more about it there as well. Jessica and I were actually on the same cruise together. We took a couple pictures together. Maybe one of these days I'll show you our pictures there from our Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. That's one of the few pictures I will show you. Everything else is sort of what happens in the ship stays in the ship. But that we will show you. You can also talk to Jessica, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also check out royaldogs.com. Great website that she's put together, royaldogs.com. And that will give you everything you need to know about the Dog Nation cruise coming up and every cool thing coming up with the Royal Caribbean in the very near future. Jessica's an expert on all of that, and you can talk to her about that today. All right, a little bit of a coaching theme to our SEC through here today, starting with this. Charlie Strong, who's been about everywhere and is obviously a respected name in football, is reportedly on his way to Alabama now. And it looks like he's going to be a quality control analyst there with the Crimson Tide. Now, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on at Alabama, and a lot of it sort of leads to the question of, well, is Bama still Bama? Is this still the robust dynasty that it's been, in the past, or is this a little bit of a declining empire here right now when it comes to Crimson Tide? I did notice the other day, we may do something on this more at some point in time. For instance, do you know who Bill Conley is, the sort of math nerd guy from ESPN? He does his SP Plus analytics rankings. I saw where Alabama was preseason number 4 in those rankings. To my knowledge, this is the lowest Alabama's ever been, by probably a pretty wide margin in terms of a preseason numeric projection for the upcoming year. So that's one of those things that Alabama just sort of has facing in this upcoming season of, well, is this still Bama? Analytics don't love them as much as they used to. No obvious starting quarterback in place here, although someone like Ty Simpson may turn out to be pretty good. Not really hitting the transfer portal for Jahmyr Gibbs this year the way they would have done a year ago. Kind of hard to figure out, exactly what's going on there. But to be fair and balanced here for a moment, if you want to know, an example of the fact that there is at least still a perception out there that Bama is still Bama, when it comes to the really valuable asset of quality control analysts, the kind of guys that, this is what Will Muschamp at one point in time was at Georgia before becoming first special teams coach, then co-defensive coordinator, what Mike Bobo was at Georgia prior to becoming offensive coordinator, what Buster Faulkner was at Georgia prior to becoming Georgia Tech's offensive coordinator. When it comes to these quality control defensive analysts, or just analysts in general, they are really important to the success of a team. People who follow Georgia closely can certainly explain how a lot of these kind of quality control guys have ended up being impactful. The best teams will have the best of them, and in some cases the best teams have the most of them, although no one had more than Florida, and that clearly didn't work for them, but that's a different topic for a different day. The point here, though, is that the best available analysts, though, are only going to choose to work at a small handful of schools. Georgia can hire the best available, former coordinators, guys with a lot of experience, guys that had other career options. In some cases, Georgia analysts have chosen to take quality control work at UGA, much smaller salary, as opposed to on-field jobs other places, just because it's good to work at a place like Georgia. Well, once again, to be fair and balanced, at least as fair and balanced as we're willing to be, a guy like Charlie Strong going to Alabama in a situation like this is also an example of that. There's still the perception of folks within the coaching ranks that, hey, it's still good to be connected to this Alabama program. That things aren't receding enough yet that a guy like Strong, who's got options, doesn't want to potentially hitch his wagon to a place like Alabama. And I'm not saying that, Charlie Strong, kind of standing at the periphery of this program is going to change the fortunes and the outcome for the upcoming year. But it is still a little bit of an indication that there is some strength in place at Alabama, and a team that lost 2 games in the regular season a year ago. Maybe they come back and replicate that same thing, and maybe they go 10-2 again. But also maybe there's a chance that they don't. Maybe they unseat LSU as the SEC West champion, and maybe they stand on the other side of Georgia, who we believe is going to win the SEC East, and will be the final SEC championship game of the division era. Bama is a fascinating story for this upcoming season. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. By the way, speaking of LSU, they also make a little bit of a coaching move. Once again, promoting an analyst, John Jancic, who, was at Georgia. At this point in time, I think that John Jancic has actually coached everywhere. I think this may be the final coaching stop for his coaching career. He can now check every box of every school in the entire country. He's been like Cincinnati defensive coordinator. He's obviously worked at Tennessee, Georgia a couple of times. I believe he was an analyst at Georgia. Was he here in 2021? A lot of this kind of stuff runs together after a while. But the point is, Jancic has coached everywhere. In a lot of places, he's coached twice. And now he's going to be outside linebackers coach and special teams coordinator, I guess you'll call him that, for LSU. And it sort of speaks to me as well of, we don't talk a ton about the way in which certain teams divide their coaching responsibilities, but this could become a little bit of an interesting thing in the future where, at one point in time, there was the debate of, well, do you want a special teams coordinator or not? And I remember back during the Mark Richt era here at Georgia, when the Georgia special teams weren't performing very well, when you had some sloppy special teams play, there was this thought of, well, if you just sort of dedicate a special teams coordinator to all this, then it would get better. And for a while, that seemed like a thing that some teams wanted to do. But then you kind of seem like it's kind of gone more in vogue lately to kind of divide those special teams responsibilities or whatever else. But the point is now Georgia's got 2 defensive backs coaches, somebody to work with the safety, somebody to work with the cornerbacks, because you're playing nickel coverage more often than not. That's 5 defensive backs in the field. That's almost half your defense. It seems like you might want more than one coach responsible for that many players in the field at one point in time. Also, some teams have quarterbacks coach, some teams don't. I think the division of responsibilities among assistant coaches is one of those things we maybe in the future should pay a little bit more attention to. And to speak of LSU here for a moment, the staff that Jansen now finds himself on, this is also kind of a fascinating thing. A lot of times you see the big step up in year 2 for a coach. Last year, Brian Kelly took a big step in year 1. Is this a true, authentic, legitimate playoff contender? Is this a team that's better than Alabama? The early indications is that Alabama's getting a little bit more respect in terms of actually competing for the playoff, but I'm not really quite so sure how you get there on that, given the fact that I saw LSU beat Alabama last year in a game that didn't really look like a fluke. So one way or another, it's the end of the era here in the SEC. The final years of that era, in a lot of ways, have been defined by Alabama and LSU competing with each other in the SEC West. I believe that's going to be true again this year there as well. And then one more story to give you here for just a moment. News coming out of Tennessee. And if you're a Georgia fan, there's at least something kind of funny about this because a lot of these are sort of blasts from the past names. I want to read this straight from CBSSports.com here for a moment because it's a little bit complicated language. But you've got a handful of former Tennessee assistants who've been given show cause penalties for violating NCAA rules. This is stemming back from the Jeremy Pruitt era as Tennessee coach. So it's actually Sports Illustrated, I should say, that identifies those who are getting these NCAA penalties. It's inside linebackers coach Brian Niedermeyer. You will remember him as that's the big bank takes little bank guy, right? Isn't he the one that did the big bank takes little bank guy on Jim Chaney when he got hired there? I think it might be. You got outside linebackers coach Shelton Felton. Shelton Felton's the Valdosta high school coach now, but he was also Crisp County coach when Big Cat Bryant went to Auburn. So that's a little bit of a blast from the past. And then you got player personnel Drew Hughes, director of player personnel Drew Hughes, and student assistant Michael Magnus. So they have, I think this is being described as sort of negotiating plea deals with the NCAA. They get the show cause penalty. Among the names not mentioned, though, is Jeremy Pruitt. So apparently Pruitt is going to fight this to the end of the NCAA. I think you can probably read between the lines on this that if all of this was clear on Pruitt, he would have had a much better chance of being Alabama defensive coordinator. The reason that Bama hires Kevin Steele instead of Jeremy Pruitt, I think you're left to conclude, is probably because of some of this NCAA stuff. So it sounds like for now, Jeremy Pruitt's still fighting to clear his name. Who knows when any of this stuff gets resolved? But of the couple of guys that have worked for him, have taken their deal, they get the show cause. And so we'll see where all of this goes after that. But a couple of names of note for Georgia fans kind of in the mix there on that. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, really quickly here, I want to give you a quick shout-out about something that's really fun coming up. Obviously, we've had warm weather as of late. That's been really kind of nice. A lot of you are kind of getting back to your kids playing baseball again. My son started. I know our producer, Michael Carvell, he's got his kids out there playing baseball, softball there as well. But also Major League Baseball on the way back, too. In fact, for the Atlanta Braves, spring training right now going on in Northport, Florida. And if you want to follow all of the great storylines for the Braves as we get ready for the upcoming season, as the Braves get ready in spring training here right now in the Grapefruit League down there in Florida, I want you to watch Behind the Braves, presented by Global Payment on YouTube right now. And it kind of gives you a really cool sort of behind-the-scenes, inside look at what's going on with the Braves right now. Vaughn Grissom, Orlando Arcia competing to become the next starting shortstop. Michael Harris, I would say, on his way to kind of feeling like one of the next big stars for this Braves team, maybe one of the big stars across all of baseball there as well. You got a real battle going on, the Braves starting rotation, too. We actually talked about some of that yesterday on our First and 15 here on the DawgNation video channels, DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app. Well, you can watch this on Behind the Braves, presented by Global Payment right there on YouTube. It's a really cool look at what's happening with Atlanta right now. Of course, the Braves trying to win that 6th straight National League East. I grew up at a time in which the Braves are putting together a great string of division wins. They're working on another pretty good streak here on that right now. So here's what you can do. You can go to YouTube, Behind the Braves. It's presented by Global Payment, and get a really cool look at the Atlanta Braves in the Grapefruit League there at Northport, getting ready for a really fun season. Some really exciting young faces making this Braves team one of the most fun teams to watch in all of Major League Baseball, and certainly my favorite team, many of yours there too. So get a good look with them Behind the Braves on YouTube. Check them out here right now today. All right, so with that said, I want to get into something more serious here for just a couple of minutes, and I promise you, no one wants to be preached at. No one wants anything too heavy-handed. So I'm going to be kind of quick with this here for a moment, but there is something I want to I've been thinking about this. Let me say it that way. I have been thinking about this in the aftermath of sort of what we learned a little bit yesterday involving the Jalen Carter situation, his presence at the accident that resulted in the loss of life for Devin Willock and Chandler LaCroix, and kind of where Georgia goes from here on all of that. And like the one thing that's been kind of reverberating in my head a little bit is something Kirby Smart said last summer, unrelated to any of this, of course, but kind of an overarching message for his team. And I think the words that Smart said back then, I think ought to be taken really seriously now. And I believe that Smart's probably ready to, if not already in the midst of delivering a similar message to this. But I can't help but think a little bit lately about something that Smart said last year. I'm going to play this clip for you, and then I'm going to explain why I think it's so relevant right now. At SEC Media Days in Atlanta last July, Smart talking about the kind of mindset he's trying to instill in the Georgia program. About 20 seconds worth here. Here's Kirby.
Our guys have asked questions, and we've done a lot of studies on how the mighty have fallen. So we have skull sessions. We have 15-minute meetings, 20-minute meetings in breakout groups, and we've actually taught how the mighty have fallen. I'm talking about in business. I'm talking about in sports. I'm talking about in history. So you learn from the mistakes of others.
So how the mighty fall is a phrase that Kirby Smart used there a few times. Now, I'm a little bit of a geek. I like to read. The phrase how the mighty fall, I believe, comes from a book written by a guy named Jim Collins. I like books like this. Jim Collins is a very, very good writer, terrific speaker, speaking on the stuff that he writes about. But he's kind of a business author. He's got several really famous books. One of those is How the Mighty Fall. And what he does in the book is he goes and looks at companies that used to be really successful. And if you're in the company at the time, you would have never imagined that one day they may fall, that one day they may fall apart, one day they may, fizzle. And yet you can certainly study business over the course of decades and see plenty of examples of that. And so what Collins tried to study is the commonalities that connect a lot of these great organizations that eventually kind of fizzle out, that kind of fall, how the mighty fall. That is what Jim Collins studied. And I'm assuming that Kirby Smart using that phrase, I'm assuming here that probably comes from the Jim Collins book, How the Mighty Fall. And if you look at that book, many of you have probably read it. If not, I think you probably like it if you're interested in that kind of thing at all. The one thing that Collins says in the book is that sort of the first step towards a mighty organization falling, the first step towards that happening is, and I love the way in which Collins sort of phrases this. He says the first step towards all of that is that there is a hubris born of success. Now, hubris is sort of a fancy word. It just simply means arrogance. There is a hubris born of success, that at a certain point you are so successful that you believe that, I guess to say it in my own language, that you are so successful that you believe that you're always only going to be successful. And anything you do will result in success because you are a successful person. And those of us who've lived a little bit, it doesn't take us very many examples to sort of prove that, no, that's not true. That no matter how good you think you are in one moment, you are only a day away, a moment away from realizing, just how possible failure really is, or downturn, really is. And I can't help but think about those words from Kirby in light of what's going on right now with some folks who've, made decisions they would regret, or even when it comes to Georgia football itself, kind of, I told you yesterday, I'm not quite so sure I love everything about the way that Georgia's kind of handled this either. And a lot of this from Georgia kind of stems, you might be led to believe, from the success the organizations enjoy. I mean, Georgia's won back-to-back national championships. The players who've been a part of this program have done such a good job of contributing to all that success, that finding the humility necessary to know that you've still got to make good decisions, finding the humility necessary to know that you've still got to be careful. That's not an easy thing to do, but finding someone to sort of pump that humility into the program, for the individuals involved with the program to pump that humility into their own lives, to remind you of, hey, just because I've been successful doesn't mean I'm not one bad decision away from ruining all of this. I just think that's one of those important things to keep in mind. And as I told Terrence Edwards a little earlier, I don't know how you communicate this, because people have been trying to communicate this for darn near centuries, and it just seems like it's never easy to do, but it never stops being relevant. That As an organization, once you've been successful, it's easy to believe that's all you'll ever be. Or as an individual, once you are a part of success and once you've been praised for being a great athlete, being this, being that, it's sort of easy to believe that's all you ever will be. But all of us are just simply a sum total of the decisions that we make. And a bad decision can change everything. Even a bad decision made in an instance, even a bad decision made over the course of a couple of seconds can change everything. And so I guess the only thing you can hope to take from all of this is that in the future, there's more clarity about that kind of thing. It's obviously a terrible tragedy. It's the kind of thing that we feel like we're going to be dealing with for time to come. And I guess everybody's going to have their 2 cents on it. And I guess that was mine there. So no easy way to transition back out of that into something happier and more enjoyable, but we do like to try to have fun around here, and we conclude things with our golden shoe. In fact, we've had the studio used for different things the last couple of days, and because of that, I guess I have forgotten to kind of put our great mascot, Eddie the Blind Squirrel, on the desk where he belongs. He is the mascot of DawgNation Daily. Even today, I noticed that I have not put Eddie back on here. So it's a little bit unusual for me because we haven't had a lot of folks using the studio. We've had some of that the last couple of days. I got to remember to make sure that Eddie is right back where he needs to be. But some of our audience was noticing that Eddie was missing. In fact, I'll show you that as a part of our golden shoe here today. Frankie Fibonacci writes in. Frankie's always really funny. He says, me, Visor Talk, that's a Green Soldier, and Jay Shops were all worried about where Eddie was in the show today. But I found him. It seems he was up north in Indianapolis helping Mike Griffith. You see, if you're watching a video anyway, you see Eddie at the Combine saying, BA, there are more dogs than gators here at the Combine, which you love the idea of that. And so that's pretty funny stuff from Frankie, and a nice way to kind of get us back on kind of a happy note to close out the show today. And by the way, speaking of those lousy, stinking gators, 240 days from right now, nice even number, 240 days from right now, Dogs back in Jacksonville, beating up on Florida again. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. And we'll see all of you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time. They will do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. We will take your comments on whatever you'd like to discuss here today, and we'll just sort of see where it goes from there. Frank Patterson says, oh, snap, I made the show. Yeah, Frankie, that was funny. That was funny. That was good stuff. Bilbo Baggins says, would you like to see the Georgia-Florida series? First of all, around here, we say Georgia-Florida. Played at home stadiums instead of Jacksonville. Well, here's the thing, Bilbo, that a lot of us have kind of resigned ourselves to. At least some people have resigned themselves to. No matter how much you love the cocktail party, it seems like it's likely coming to an end. So I think a lot of us are making peace with the idea that that no matter how much fun the cocktail party has been, and frankly, I'd love to see it continue, the odds are, I would say that it's probably this may be the last year of it ever. I think it's possible that's the case, and if it's not the last year, it could be among the very last years. Jonathan Aaron says, I claim to be the old man on the porch. Am I the one yelling at kids on the grass or on the cloud? Am I yelling at clouds? Well, hopefully I don't actually yell at kids. I'll take yelling at clouds. I'll be first of all, also I aspire to be as wise one day as Abraham Simpson. That's his name, right? That's the yell at clouds guy. So I would much rather yell at clouds than yell at kids, I guess, for sure. Let's see what else. Yeah, so a lot of folks kind of weighing in on some of the topic of hand. Let me scroll back up here a little bit too. Paul Moon, the subject of speeding. He says, I'm sure speeding's going to be a big conversation going forward, and it probably will be. But I guess the point I like trying to make is that, to me, this is about more, and this is not just a Georgia thing, this is kind of an everything thing. It's about more than, hey, just make sure you're not out there speeding. Like, it's more about, hey, make sure you're not making any decision that puts your entire future in jeopardy. And as I said before, adults have been trying to do this. Older people have been trying to convey this message to younger people forever. And it just never gets any easier to convey. It never gets any easier to resonate. It's just a difficult thing of, I said this yesterday. Fast cars are always going to be cool. It doesn't need an explanation. They just are. They're cool because they're cool. Fast cars are just cool. And if you got a fast car, it's fun to go fast in it, I guess. But, there are also some inherent risks and some dangers that go along with that put your entire future in jeopardy. And we see just how tragically true that is in this particular situation. But it's more than just, hey, we're going to have a zero tolerance for street racing. It's more than that, and it's more than just Georgia who deals with something like that. This is about, if you want to be honest, there are a lot of football stories that don't end in a happy fashion. So, to be, once again, it comes across like such a blowhard to say it this way, but being a good football player, or maybe said better, being someone who enjoys a good life because of football requires more than just working on your body. You got to work on your spirit too a little bit. You got to be the kind of person that looks forward to a successful conclusion to all of this, and that just kind of matters. William Perry, I actually saw William put this in the DawgNation comment section before the show began. I think he's kind of right about this. He says we need Davin Bellamy to come back and speak. Our folks need to humble themselves, from the accent to a lot of different things. I think that's probably true. I do. And I know this is going to sound corny, but there's that old country song that says it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. Well, Georgia was perfect this season. They were 15-0. And when it is hard to be humble, that means you have to work really hard to stay humble, because humility does matter. Humility does matter. There are some of us who do truly believe that pride comes before a fall. And I mean that from an organizational standpoint, because I don't know that Georgia handled this as well as it could have. And I mean this from an individual standpoint, because we certainly have plenty of evidence that not every individual, made the best possible decisions they could have. So working to stay humble enough to understand that you are not impervious to consequence, that's really, really important. It is. And I know I sound like a blowhard for saying that, but I do believe it's true. Let's see what else. Yeah, Paul Moon kind of echoing some of the same stuff. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on. Let me pop over to Facebook here for a moment. Let's see what else is going on over here. Senior Dog 54 pointing out that, a lot of the players right now have a lot more money than they maybe used to. And in some cases, that's true. I also believe that for a good while now, players have had a little bit more spending money than you might would have realized. When a lot of your sort of basic necessities are already kind of taken care of, a lot of the clothes you wear because it's, athletic gear, a lot of the food that you eat, place that you live. The average player's probably had a little bit more folding money than you kind of think. It has been pretty common for a number of years across a lot of the SEC for players to actually drive nicer cars than you might assume they would, just because of the fact that, you don't expect to see a young person driving a very nice car. But in some respects, that nice car is sort of reflected the fact that there's nothing else the parents pay for. everything else the kids already paid for, so might as well buy them a nice car. That it's actually been fairly common across a lot of college football to see a lot of players driving slightly nicer cars than you might would have assumed a young person would be driving. For probably a good bit of time here. Let's see what else. Truth Teller says that Chris Smith is killing it on his combine press conference right now. That's good to know. Okay, well, good for Chris Smith. That's awesome. Let me go to Facebook now. I said I was going to go to there. I popped over to DawgNation.com first. We'll try to play some of the Chris Smith tomorrow. Let us see what else over here on the Facebook side of things here for a moment. Keith Finley says he hopes the Cowboys draft Nolan Smith. I could see that being a pretty good fit. Barry Watkins, subject to Broderick Jones. Jeff Ingram says, I'm surprised that Jake Scott didn't drive his vet over the top of the Coliseum. So for those of you who don't know, if you go to like the Stegman Coliseum where Georgia plays basketball, there's this little bit of fencing on these. So Stegman Coliseum is built in a very unusual way. There's like this like ramping that goes from the ground all the way up the top of that. When I was a kid, I used to kind of crawl on it some. But Jake Scott, when he was, many years prior to that, was famous for supposedly driving a motorcycle on the top of it, which would have been possible, but gosh, it would have been crazy dangerous. So, the idea of people doing dangerous things, that didn't become in vogue in 2023, unfortunately. But yeah, that's what Scott, who was, a very good football player, went on to play for the 72 Dolphins. That's what he was allegedly famous for doing, or I should say famous for allegedly doing, which is driving a motorcycle at the top of Stegman Coliseum, which you could have done back then. Let's see what else. Keith Folds says he thinks a 3-way rotation between campus, Jacksonville for the cocktail party be the way to go. A lot of people do like that. But I don't get the impression that's where we're going. Gary Holt says, did you see where Nolan said he'd like to be a coach? I think he'd be a good one. I do think he'd be a good one. I do. That's the kind of guy you need in coaching. I do. I mean, I would love to see, like, if I was in charge of something, I think this is what I would do. I think I would try to create a little bit of I don't even know what this is, but I think that more players should be convinced to go into coaching. I do. Here's what I think happens, and I'm only making an assumption. I'm obviously not on the inside on this, but I think a lot of players are so kind of locked in on the idea they're going to play in the NFL. And in a place like Georgia, a lot of the players, that's a very reasonable assumption to make. And because that's a big payday, and because it's the kind of big payday that you could get in the near term, it's easy to get sort of fixated on that. I think the fixation on playing in the NFL then kind of takes you away from the other things you should think about. But, let's say that Nolan Smith, let's say, I'm going to just use a hypothetical here for a moment. Let's say that Nolan's shoulder injury or whatever prevented him from playing football. If that's not the case, we'll just say it did. And he couldn't play in the NFL. You could go be a coach at a Georgia high school for the next 20, 30 years, and over the course of a long career like that, you're going to end up making a really good sum of money. And a lot of the guys I know that coach high school football, listen, that's got its own challenges too. A lot of the guys I know who coach high school football, that's a great life. You love it. You make good money. You're a part of a team. I just think we got to be pushing more players into the idea of, hey, be a coach. Have it's a rewarding career. It can be financially lucrative, but it's also that's the kind of guy that you want in coaching. You want guys like that in the coaching process. And I don't know. Like a lot of you know what like job fairs are and things like that. I think we ought to have more coaching job fairs among the ranks of players. Maybe there's more of that going on than I realize, but I think they should do that. Philip Jordan Wells says if Georgia wins a go for 3 in 23, I should just take an entire offseason of cruises. I think there is a guy that does this. I think there is a guy that sort of lives on a cruise ship. Maybe I will do that. Maybe I'll just go from ship to ship. Like the one thing we haven't quite perfected yet is the idea of streaming the show from the ship. If we could figure that out, I might not come back. My boss happens to be in the other side of the glass. He just shook his head no. So apparently that's not going to happen. But there you go. But I do believe there is a guy who does live on a ship. He just goes from one ship to the next. I believe there is somebody who does that. Let's see what else. Miriam Corbin, Keith Folds also talking about the end of the run there in Jacksonville. Yeah, so the way it works is I'm not an expert on the contract necessarily, but this is the last stated year of the contract, and there are option years after that. So this could be kind of that clean break, and it just all seems to be timing out pretty well with a lot of change in the SEC next year, expanded playoff, expanded SEC, the dissolution of the divisions. Boy, all this seems to be kind of timing up pretty well, doesn't it? Rightly or wrongly, that seems to be the case. Frank Patterson getting ready to go to work. Frank, we appreciate you being here. Nice to see you doing a little work for a change. I'm just kidding, of course. Let's see what else. Fred Gunn says that Nolan Smith seems like a master motivator. His presence on the sideline last season was instrumental. It truly was. Taylor Russell asks a really good question. This is a good question. Who has a better season upcoming? Dominic Lovett or Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint? So what you're really asking here is, what matters more? Better numbers, Lovett did have them, away from UGA, or pretty good numbers but familiar with the program? And there's a little bit of a changeover at offensive coordinators, so maybe that kind of, brings a little bit of discussion into this. That's really interesting because, y'all, Dominic Lovett put up big numbers last year. He's one of the leading wide receiver pass catchers in the entire league. He had almost 900 yards receiving. That's a huge, huge total, especially for a guy who was kind of playing on the inside a pretty good bit. On the other hand, and I know I use the word underrated probably more than I should, I really think that Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint was one of the more underrated players for Georgia. Like, his receiving total last year was a 370, something like that. That doesn't seem, all that big compared to what some of the other guys in the Georgia situation did, but I think he was the number 5 pass catcher on the team. And if you look at a lot of years for Georgia, that nearly 400 yards receiving was actually stood up pretty well against some of the other totals in a lot of years for Georgia. The point is Rosemy-Jacksaint was pretty productive, and I don't have the film or the stats to back this up, but just my eye test kind of tells me that when Stetson really needed a completion last year, he felt pretty comfortable throwing the way of Rosemy-Jacksaint. So I notice I've been now talking for several minutes. I haven't answered your question. I guess I'm coming across as a politician on that. But I don't know that I have an answer, but I think it's a really good question. I think it's a really good question. I'll say this. I am pretty high on both these guys. For slightly different reasons. DMart42 on the subject of Kendall Milton. I know that Mike Bobo is forever controversial, and I know that losing an offensive coordinator who did so many good things for Georgia is itself not exactly received as great news. I understand all of that. But the transition, I think, creates some opportunities, and I think Mike Bobo does bring an opportunity. I know that people bring up the run the damn ball Bobo meme or whatever, but I do believe the transition to Bobo here brings up the opportunity to kind of restore a little bit of what once made Georgia a great rushing attack. And I think Kendall Milton could benefit from that. JC asked about he's asking G. Grace about the quarterback for Bama. G. Grace, Bama fans want Ty Simpson, right? I mean, that's the guy they want. They want Simpson, right? Fred Gunn says that Lovett's going to have to improve his blocking. He's going to probably have to be asked to do a little bit more of that kind of thing, even on the inside. That's probably true. It's like, if you're going to play the same position that Kearis Jackson played, Jackson is pretty rocked up for receiver. So that's obviously, a little bit of a challenge. Let's see what else. DMart42 and Paul Moon joined. Notice my little jab. I'm only having fun. Every now and then I got to pick on y'all a little bit. Let's see what else. DMart42 on the subject of the Georgia schedule. Listen, here's the thing. I can't hear anybody complaining about Georgia's schedule of the so-called they ain't played nobody stuff. I can't hear that. Last year, Georgia won the national championship game 65-7. The biggest issue with the notion that Georgia isn't playing anyone is there almost isn't anyone for Georgia to play. They won the SEC championship by 3 touchdowns. They won the national championship by darn near 100 points. There isn't anyone for Georgia to play. The reason why it seems like they, to use the old meme, ain't played nobody is because they ain't nobody for them to play. They could have beaten Tennessee as bad as they wanted to in November. Who do you want them to play that's going to give them a game? At some point in time, the responsibility rests on the rest of college football to compete, not for Georgia to seek out somebody to go play. All right, let's see what else. A few more comments here. J. Bob says that Bobo's the new Stetson for controversy. Probably so. And like the other day, what we tried to do is, okay, let's at least keep it fair. If this is going to be the ongoing debate, let's at least keep it fair. Let's define what success looks like so that we can have something to judge it later on. And what I said was at the time is, you can't say that Bobo is a failure if Georgia doesn't win a third straight national championship, because no one's done that. And however you define modern age of college football, the last three-peat was well before the modern age began. So the notion of a three-peat alone is not fair here. You can't judge Bobo if UGA has a bad game because, listen, we all love Todd Monken. Monken had bad games. They didn't score an offensive touchdown against Clemson in 2021. Not a very pretty game against Kentucky this year. You could probably cite other examples there too. Even Todd Monken, who was a stellar offensive coordinator, even he had some bad games, I'd say, when it comes to leading the Georgia offense. So, it's not fair to judge Bobo on the basis of the three-peat or the go for 3 and 23. It's not fair to judge him on the basis of does he avoid having a bad game. Even Monken had the occasional bad game. To me, it comes down to, does Georgia average something close to what it has averaged the last couple of years, somewhere right around 40 points? Do they score those points in the big games? Georgia scored 50, 90. They scored almost 200 points in the playoffs, or did they score? Yeah, almost 200 points in the postseason this year. So that's a fair thing to judge Bobo on. You got to show up and score points in the postseason. Pristine conditions, you're inside. No reason that you shouldn't be able to pile up points. So judge him on that. That's fair. Georgia last year had 98 plays of 20 or more yards, creating those explosives. Judge him on that. But that's, to me, that to me is how you judge Mike Bobo. And if any of those categories are left lacking, then call it out. But my guess is it's going to probably end up being pretty similar to what it was. But I do believe, much like it was with Stetson Bennett, is that I think that Bobo, even if he does produce similar results, will be treated a little bit different than Todd Monken was treated. Big J4 asked about how you see the defensive backfield playing out this season. I would say that Dalen Everett's going to have a chance to earn himself a starting job over there. I think the other safety spot's going to kind of be interesting. Georgia has had now for, you talk about, being RBU or linebacker U. I mean, Georgia's really kind of been safety U, right? Because you think about, you got like bedrock Chris Smith, and before him it was Lewis Sane, before him it was Richard LeCounte, before him it was J.R. Reed. You had this great transition of great all-American level safeties that have been, a part of this Georgia program. Many of them actual All-Americans, but kind of a sort of all-American level of play. And so now Malachi Starks in year two, I don't know that anybody played more snaps than Starks did for Georgia this past season. Now Malachi Starks, you would hope, kind of transitions to be that kind of next bedrock guy, but who's the less experienced safety you put next to him? Does Janelle Aguero get a chance there? Does Javon Bullard transition from a star to a safety? What you do there alongside that's going to be, pretty interesting. I think it's so that's what it comes down to. The cornerback that replaces Keely Ringo, Dalen Everett may have the first shot at that. The other safety opposite Malachi Starks, is that a transition for Javon Bullard? That's what it kind of comes down to for me as the big topics with that defensive secondary. Randy Glass checking in to say, I do think that Kirby Smart's going to have to tighten up the culture with this program. Kids will be kids, but all this program success is a slippery slope for entitlement and distraction to set in. I think that's the case. The word I used yesterday as it relates to this specific incident is, let me say it this way, and I'm going to be really, really, really brief about this. I think there's only so much defense you can play against tragedy. Sometimes tragedy just strikes. Even if you try to protect yourself from every angle, sometimes tragedy just strikes. That's just a thing. You almost can't help it, or at least sometimes it seems that way. I have a slight issue with Georgia in the aftermath of this. I think the word I used yesterday was sloppy. I sort of feel like Georgia comes across a little bit sloppy in the aftermath of this. And I'm not really I'm not even, all that, willing to necessarily go into more detail about why I feel that way. But I think Georgia could have had a little tighter response to some of this. I do. And, who's to say I'm right? My opinion may not be worth anything. But, a little tighter response on some of this I think would have been better for UGA too. So that's just kind of my opinion, and I try to be as honest with you as I possibly can be. Let me get some more comments. Alan Verbanch, to go back to the schedule talk from a moment ago, says that Georgia's beating the top teams that make it to the college football playoff. Yeah, I mean, Georgia is throttling, very, very good teams. Ohio State's hanging a banner for even keeping it close with the UGA. So, that's part of the issue with, some of this right now. Let's see what else. And Joseph Kennedy and Bill Sanders on the subject like a Michigan. That's another one of those teams that's kind of out there. Yeah, I don't want to hear a word about them. After, what we saw on the field in 2021 with two teams, kind of a similar stature what they are now. We sort of saw all that. Let's see what else. Pete Williams says it's just life. Yeah, I mean, in some respects, it just kind of is. I mean, we even see this in our own life there as well. It's like there's just only so much defense you can play against, like, really, really bad things. Let's see what else. We're going to get ready to wrap up here. David Thomas also mentioning Dirty Dan Jackson. Yeah, fun nickname. But, yeah, Dan Jackson's a part of all this, too, for sure. So Jimbo Sliced Bread brings up something we've talked about on the show. Now, I'm going to say this. I meant to say this on the show the other day, and I forgot to. Jimbo Sliced Bread says that Bama's only title in the last 5 years is the 2020 COVID asterisk title. We are the standard now. So let's talk COVID asterisk for a minute, because y'all know this is a little bit of a hot topic for me. So let's run through all of the things in sort of the COVID year that haven't really been true since then. Y'all love to give me a hard time about Jimbo Fisher, including Jimbo Sliced Bread here. Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M was top 5 in 2020. Maybe should have even made the playoff that year. Haven't been close to that since then. That's a COVID asterisk thing that was true that year, not true later on. Florida won the SEC East that year, gave Alabama all it wanted in the SEC championship game. Haven't been close to that level since then. That's a COVID asterisk type thing you'd be very careful with. We've talked before about who's the quarterback that went BYU that the Jets drafted that has been terrible since going to the NFL. The entire success story for Wilson there was told during that 2020 season, playing against no defenses at a time in which defense weren't even practicing, makes a name for himself. BYU's really good, gets drafted by the Jets, hasn't looked good since then. I'm going to give you another example of this, too. Do you know who the Tampa Bay Bucks are about to entrust their football future to at quarterback? That'd be the former Gator Kyle Trask. Another one of these guys that came of age during the COVID year, the asterisk year. If I'm a Bama fan, this makes me really nervous. Let me tell you why. Because if Trask, who I believe will, but if he does fall flat on his face as the starter in Tampa, it's another example of, hey, what seemed like it was true back in 2020 just never was able to replicate itself in a non-COVID atmosphere. When the stadiums were full, when the teams were practicing, when the defenses were meeting with each other, all of a sudden a lot of these prolific offenses, they weren't just marching down the field quite as much anymore when it came to real football. Watch Kyle Trask in Tampa. Watch him this year. See if he travels the same path that what's-his-name from the Jets does. Another one of these sort of COVID heroes that turns out not to be quite as good in another type of situation. And if I'm Alabama, that does make me a little nervous because that's the sum total I have for the last, 5 years? Beyond that, 2018, embarrassing loss to Clemson. 2019, gave up darn near 50 points in your own stadium to LSU. 2021, obviously, lost to Georgia in the national championship, hard-fought game, but lost the game. 2022, lost twice in the regular season. All of this is a little bit easier to take because, hey, you're the national champion in 2020. But was that real? Based on all the stuff that happened around that kind of haven't been real since then? I mean, for those of you that follow the NBA, that's, LeBron James' bubble title. Does that seem real to you? Based on what the Lakers have been, since then in a true 82-game season where you're playing home games, road games, and everything else? Does the LeBron bubble title seem real? Does that bubble ring seem real to you? I don't think it does. If I'm an Alabama fan, I'm not concern trolling here. I'm being serious. If I'm an Alabama fan, that makes me very, very nervous. Very nervous. Let's see what else. All right, final comments. We got to go. We're going to get ready to get out of here. Brandon Griffin says if we win the third championship in a row, it's going to put us in the greatest programs of all time conversation. I think it has to, right? I mean, I just think it's unquestionably true. And I also think it's going to be really, really hard. Really, really hard. I just think I'm a little bit of a respecter of history, and, we've seen teams try this and fail. And, maybe they came close, but still didn't ultimately get it done. So going into last year, I really did feel that Georgia was much more of a national championship contender than a lot of people thought they were. Hopefully we reflected that on the show. And yet going into this year, I think there are a lot of, at least I think there are some Georgia fans that assume this is going to be easy because Georgia is just seemingly way better than everybody else. But I have a tendency to sort of think that this is actually harder, and last year was actually a little bit more reasonable to assume it possible. I'm just kind of a natural contrarian, and I do think that, well, I'm not going to be a wet blanket. I obviously believe that Georgia has a very good chance to win the national championship, and they very well likely might. But I do have a sneaking suspicion that it's going to be a little harder than some people assume it is. And you say, well, why it's going to be harder? That's the thing about college football. It has a way of revealing something to us that we can't even imagine right now. So who knows? Who knows? But I do get the sense this might turn out to be, even if it happens, even if Georgia actually does win it, I get the sense it might turn out to be a little harder than some people think it might. All right. Anything else? One more time before we go. Fred Gunn also pointing out the Braves championship was not a COVID championship. That's 2021, full stadiums. Yeah, the COVID story for Major League Baseball is the Dodgers, right? gazillion-dollar payroll, always chokes in the playoffs. But you give them a short season, you give them all that, all of a sudden the Dodgers kind of figure out a way. That hasn't really replicated itself post-COVID either. Another good example there. All right, we got to go. Thanks for being here. Y'all check out Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, ajc.com. There's all kinds of stuff away from sports to follow. You got the Buckhead City thing going on right now. You can kind of follow that. I told you about Brave Spring Training. What's next there. Also, I do think the story of Michael Harris is going to be a really fun one this year. I know Chipper Jones has spent some time around AJC, I should say, around spring training. You can tell it's the end of the show. I can't talk anymore. Spring training there in Northport, and Chipper really praised Harris a lot, kind of compared him to Ronald Acuna even in some respects. I know the AJC kind of wrote about that the other day. So great way to follow all of that. The start of the Quinn Snyder era as coach of the Hawks. You can get plenty on that. Falcons getting ready for the draft. It's all there for you, ajc.com on that. Okay, R.S. Andrews as well. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. Raise your hand if you've had your air conditioning on the last few days. At our house, we definitely have, especially at night. Big fellow like myself, it's got to be cool at night or I can't sleep. So if you're worried about that yourself as you head towards the spring, go to rsandrews.com and find out how you can get your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Just cost you $99. So find them online, rsandrews.com for more on that. Y'all have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp. We will look forward to talking to you then.